Good morning. Wow, you guys that breakfast was a great idea, by the way. I'm glad it was a good breakfast. That makes my job a lot easier. So I don't know how I'm going to keep this on the table, but I wanted you guys to see this bucket. He mentioned before we started that the theme this year for BaseCamp is being prepared. And the metaphor for that we came up with was this tool belt. And this is going to go home with somebody at the end of this year. So I'll leave it here in the front for you guys to marvel at. Sponsored by Lowe's. I had to pay for it, but they sponsored it. We're going to jump right into it. In 2011, there was massive flooding on the Mississippi River. 2011 affected multiple states. And it was a 500-year flood. And many of you guys may remember this and may have even been affected by this or have family that were affected by this flood. This was after Katrina. This was after all the headlines in the news were focused on New Orleans in 2006 for the flooding and the breaking of the levees. This is a few years later. But they had weeks and weeks of rain from these two different storm systems that had come through. And an unusually heavy snowy winter was melting, and all of this water was causing the river to burst at the seams. This was 2011. And in an effort to spare some of the larger cities, like New Orleans, Baton Rouge, some of these big cities, heavy population, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers decided to open up some spillways that they had installed along the river. So I don't know if you guys know that, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are responsible for flooding on the Mississippi River. And they've put in these spillways to help control that overflow. And for the first time in our country's history, they opened up all three of these spillways. And one was in Missouri, two were in Louisiana. And this is a picture of the Morganza spillway, just north of Baton Rouge. The idea of a spillway is as the water is starting to kind of crest on the river and spill over, these spillways are sort of buttresses along the river that they could open up. There's multiple gates they could open up like a dam. And they would strategically let the water out. And the idea was to let the water out into rural pasture land or farmland. Okay, this was the design. This is the U.S. Army design. And here's another angle of the same picture. 100,000 cubic feet of river water flowed through this spillway when they opened it up every second. 100,000 cubic feet. It flooded 4,600 square miles of rural Louisiana. Here's a picture taken from NASA. The yellow is the Mississippi, and the red is the spillway that you see. And so the idea is all this water that you see sort of accumulating where it's not supposed to be, strategically kind of goes through and trickles down and everything's good. The problem with this is that there were several thousand homes that were affected by this that were in these rural, lower areas, and they were sort of sacrificed for the greater good of the rest of the states, right? And it was all over the news. I don't know if you guys remember seeing, you turn on the news and suddenly there's like a flood and there's houses floating along. It's like, what's happening? What country is this in? Oh, this is in Mississippi. You're like, what? What's happening? This is where this came from. And we had highways that were completely covered and roadways, and there was devastation everywhere. Homes covered all the way up to the roof. Cars, your whole life, essentially. And I want you guys to picture the news coverage of this as they're flying over, breathlessly covering all the damage, the news helicopters. And they come over the hill, and they see this. Which I love this picture. The dam that this guy built is as high as the roof of his home. You can see the green grass in his yard. It looked from the air like this was just sort of sitting in the middle of a river, right? What did this guy know that was different than everybody else? And there were dozens of homes like this, by the way. There were dozens like this. And I have to sit there and wonder, the neighbor, as they're watching this guy for weeks, probably, building this up, what's Earl doing? Like, what are you doing? It's amazing. Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, all three were declared disaster areas by President Obama. And it's one of the most expensive tragedies and natural disasters in our country's history. So, seeing this picture, I started to think about this idea of us as Floridians living here in Florida. We're all sort of familiar with hurricanes by now, at least I hope you are. And there's this phenomenon that happens every year when the storms begin to come. And everybody's kind of cool until the few days right before it hits. And then the news, it's all you see on the news. It's everywhere. The devastation is coming. All the newspapers in the country are promoting the storm of the century. It's going to wipe us all out. And then you go to the store, and what do you see? Yeah, you see nothing. I like this one. Unfortunately, we are out of bread, but there are tortillas in aisle W6 for a peanut butter and jelly burrito. Now, you all remember seeing this. Now, you're standing there next to your buddy, and both of you are looking at this shelf, and one of you may be looking at this and thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to get the supplies I need for my family? This is crazy. I wasn't expecting this. What am I going to do? And the other one is standing there thinking, man, I'm glad I was shopping last week. Same scenario, same situation you're both in, but you're looking at it two different ways because one of you prepared ahead of time and one of you did not. One of you reacted to the danger, and one of you anticipated it. This is key. Good quote from Mr. Huxley. That men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons history has to teach. I like that quote because it's true. The theme for 2024 is the tool belt. The reason for the theme is, I don't know if you guys can sort of sense these floodwaters rising around us, but this year feels like it's going to be a tumultuous year. This is a presidential election year, by the way, in case you guys didn't know that. And no matter what your political stance is, it does not matter which party is in office come election, it's going to be half the country is going to be upset, half the country is going to be celebratory, generally. If you believe the numbers, half and half. That's pretty divisive. Hard to operate amicably in an environment that divisive. Just this morning, I'm reading about drumbeats in the Middle East over Iran. I'm seeing rumors of war. I'm seeing economic issues and things that are happening, and you guys are all sort of aware of this. Even if it's on the periphery of your focus, you're seeing it. So in anticipation of a year that could very well be a challenging year for us, the idea was that we should be equipping ourselves and preparing for these challenges. Think of it as a homeowner doing repairs on their home. Do you wait until the storm comes to fix the leak in your roof? Or do you fix it ahead of time? Do you wait until summer comes to fix the air conditioner? Or do you fix it ahead of time? And if you need help with that, call Chris White. He owns an AC company. Shameless, so shameless. Yeah, sponsored by Chris White. And so the idea is every one of those tools in the tool belt does something different. And if you're a young guy, and maybe you only have a couple of these tools, maybe you borrowed them from your dad, or maybe you're an older guy who has something like this sitting in his garage, which I'm working on that. I'm not there yet. But I love that because that represents a lifetime of learning and fixing, and every one of those tools has a story to tell. There's this scene in Gran Torino. It's a Clint Eastwood movie. If you guys haven't seen it, you should make it a general rule to see every Clint Eastwood movie you can as often as you can. Jack's like, yeah. There's this scene in this movie. If you guys aren't familiar with it, he's an old man now, but he plays an older man who's at the end of his life, content with sitting on his front porch drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon and watching the world sort of change and grumbling about it as it goes. And a neighborhood falling apart around him and seeing the homes of his friends that are no longer there sort of falling apart. And then this family moves in, and there's a young man who tries to steal his car out of his garage. And he goes from being very angry and wanting to take revenge on this kid and punish him to he starts to see this kid's got some work ethic. He's trying. He just doesn't have guidance. And so something changes in this guy's heart, in this character's heart, and he sort of takes this kid under his wing. And there's this scene where he's trying to help the kid get a job at a construction site. He says, all right, you're going to need a couple of tools. So he takes him to the garage to let him borrow a couple of tools. And the kid looks at all these tools. I love this scene. The kid looks at all these tools on the wall, a whole wall of tools. And he's like, man, I can't afford all that. There's no way I could buy all that stuff, right? And Clint Eastwood's character says, you don't buy all this stuff at once. You accumulate this through your life. This is an accumulation throughout your life. And for those of you who are sitting here today, some of you may be on one end of this spectrum where you're just starting out, and maybe you only have a few tools, and you don't really know how to use them yet. Or maybe you're at the other end, and you have all of these tools because you've gone through all of these challenges. You've gone through all the situations. You know how to fix them and solve them, and maybe your tools are sitting there collecting dust. At least some of them. I think that's an interesting dichotomy when I think about the two ends that could be here today, and for those of us who are maybe in the middle of that somewhere. Are you in a season of your life where you should be asking for guidance and mentorship from those who've come before you? Is that a resource to you? Are you at a season in your life where you have all of this information, you don't know where to put it, you don't know how to connect with that younger crowd? It's an interesting thing to think about. I think there's a reason that there's so many different ages here represented in this group and at this church in general and within our communities. And I think that there's value at both ends of this spectrum. Okay. So my tool that I want to highlight today, not very romantic and manly maybe, but every one of you has one of those carpenter's pencils in your front of your table, the middle of your table. Yeah, that's for you to take home as a souvenir to remember this awesome talk and this awesome breakfast. The carpenter's pencil is not something that you would think of as being an essential part of a tool belt maybe, but every good handyman is going to have one of these tucked behind his ear or in a pocket, right? You're making notes on the board you're about to cut. You're marking studs in a wall. It's also an interesting shape. It's rectangular and flat. That's so it doesn't roll off of an angled roof when you're sitting up on top of a ladder. It's also an interesting side note, a quick measuring tool. 1/4 inch sideways, 1/2 inch turned. You can use it to put a space between decking if you're doing deck boards. Lots of things you can use a carpenter's pencil for. But the carpenter's pencil, as good as it is not going to work for you if it's not sharpened. And standing at the top of a ladder holding up a beam with one hand and trying to reach for your pencil and it doesn't have a tip on it, it's the wrong time to try to sharpen your pencil. So the metaphor that I wanted to draw on today was this idea of being prepared ahead of time and sharpening that pencil. And when I say sharpening the pencil, I'm talking about sharpening your walk with the Holy Spirit. I'm talking about spending time in the Word. I'm talking about spending time praying to God and conversing with God and listening to God and in fellowship with other believers. This keeps your pencil sharp. This is an important thing, guys. It's a small thing. It costs 25 cents if you go to Lowe's to replace the one that I just gave you. It doesn't cost a lot, but it can do a whole lot. And before you begin any project, what are you going to do? You're going to write a list of things you need. Before you can make the list of things you need to know what you're building, so you have to kind of sketch something out. And before you can sketch something out, you're going to take measurements to figure out what the dimensions are. There's lots of things you would use a pencil for. Lots of things that you would do before you lift the hammer in preparation, in anticipation of that work. Okay. I'm going to be throwing a lot of deep wisdom to you guys. It's up to you to catch it all. I thought I'd change things up this time and go into some ancient history. Pastor Steve, that's my calling card for those of you who are just new here. I don't know what it is. I always talk about history. Go back to that Huxley quote. We're going to be in the story of Nehemiah today. Now, the story of Nehemiah, just to give you a kind of a quick overview, you have King Cyrus has released the Jews back to their homelands. About 90 years has gone by since he's made that decree, and the temple has now been rebuilt in Jerusalem. This is the second temple period. And Ezra goes a little bit before Nehemiah and brings some more with him, but now Nehemiah goes. And the reason Nehemiah goes, it tells us in chapter 1, verse 3, "And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire." So some Jews have come back to the capital of Persia, where Nehemiah is the cupbearer of the king. He's asking them, how are things in Jerusalem now that our people are going back? And they say, it's not good. The walls are completely destroyed. The gates are burned down. It's sort of sitting in ruin. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar had come and destroyed the city and the temple, that was about 240 years before this time. It's been sitting there in ruin for a long time. It's a long time. And even though the temple is now being rebuilt and the altar is back and the sacrifices are going to start back up again, there's this sense of it's not finished yet. And he mourns this news. Nehemiah mourns this for 4 months. And he spends that time praying and fasting and asking God for direction because he feels like he has to do something about this. He's not sure what he's supposed to be doing, but he feels like, I have to do something. He's asking God for guidance. And he ultimately ends up asking God for courage to speak to the king. This man, he refers to him, this king, who has the power to do something. And ultimately, the king gives him his blessing to go and to fix the wall and to take a look and see how things are looking. But more than that, he gives him his authority. He gives him letters to take to the governors in all the areas around, speaking on behalf of the king. The king makes him governor of Jerusalem. And he also gives him the support physically with timber from the royal forests. It's a big deal. Nehemiah 2, verses 9 to 10. "Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent me with officers of the army and horsemen, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel." Now when the Persians had conquered the Assyrians, they absorbed, and the Babylonians, they absorbed the land beyond the river. This is beyond the Euphrates. This is Jerusalem. This is the kingdom of Judah, Israel. And they refer to it as the land beyond the river. And so he gets sent with this official delegation. He's got some soldiers, he's got some horsemen, he's got authority. But look what happens when he comes. The powers that be that are sort of there hovering don't like what they're seeing. They don't like this idea of the Jews sort of revitalizing during this time, and they're upset. Now Nehemiah travels to Jerusalem, and here's a key detail. Before he begins any work, he secretly assesses the state of the wall and the gates under cover of darkness. He sets out to see the state of the wall with his own eyes. He doesn't rely on the reports of others. He doesn't ask for information. He goes and sees it for himself. Okay? This is a sober assessment of the situation. Sober assessment. If you were to ride around the walls of your home and you did a sober assessment of the situation of your home, what state would it be in? Have the walls of protection around your home and your family been compromised in any way? And only you can answer that. Now, seeing the state of the wall and knowing that a great work lies ahead to repair it, Nehemiah now enlists the people of Jerusalem. In chapter 2, verse 17, "Then I said to them, 'You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision.'" Derision meaning jeering or taunting. There's more at stake here than just the physical protection that this wall offers. This is the wall around the holy temple of God that you can see very clearly now through the gaps in this wall that used to be awesome, and now it's falling apart and looks like ruin. And the people around Jerusalem seem content with allowing this temple to be rebuilt. It's not until they start rebuilding the wall that they start getting upset. Why is that? I think that's really interesting. I think it's interesting to think that you would have an enemy who would be content with you sort of hiding your faith or hiding your exaltation of God. But as soon as you start blowing your trumpet and doing things that draw attention to it, he doesn't like that too much. That's interesting to me. Cultural Christians, he seems to be okay with. Why is that? So he rallies the citizens to help him build the walls, and he calls them to this holy work, and they're in. But many of the nobles decline. And the reason they decline is because they don't want to interfere with the powers that be that are already there, that are exerting influence. You have Samaria to the north, you have Ammon to the east, you have Arabia to the south, and all of these different rulers are united in their hatred of the Jews there. They're allowing them to kind of exist. But I think it's more along the lines of, look what used to be great, and look what they've been reduced to. Okay? There's a value to that. But Nehemiah is able to get support from all of the various social stratuses within the city. All these different, like goldsmiths, right? Perfume, there's a perfume maker listed in the names. Some soldiers, some nobles, regular folk, all mixed together. And he gets them to buy into this idea of repairing that section of the wall that's in front of their home. And he changes, I love Todd Stevenson's sermon on Sunday because he talked about changing your pronouns. You know, I went and Googled that. It's not what I was expecting, changing your... But it goes from being the wall to being my wall because they're fixing the wall opposite of their family, their place of work. This is my wall. And they go with gusto in fixing it. That's amazing. What an amazing way of getting this buy-in from all of these different people. It's not paying them to do it. Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. "Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, 'What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?' Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, 'Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall.'" A pile of ruin. But mixed into the insults are allusions to this idea of there's something great that these people can call upon to do miraculous things. And he's deriding that. Who is he insulting? I love this because Nehemiah hears these taunts and he hears these insults, but he recognizes that these people are really insulting God. So Nehemiah ignores them and he forges ahead. And they begin to join all of these broken sections of wall back together. And the people are all motivated, and they're working hard, and before you know it, they're halfway done. Okay. I don't know if I have this. Oh, I put the wrong slide up. I'm sorry. Why didn't anybody say anything? Alan, that's why you're sitting there. The whole point. let's go back. We're starting over. You're starting over. Now, we're going to just read this part. When Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. That's Nehemiah 4, verses 7 to 8. The enemy does not like this idea of the wall coming back together, and he actually sees it happening, represented by these 5 leaders from 5 tribes. Doesn't like seeing this work happening. They expected to make quick work of Nehemiah, that the people were going to be overwhelmed by the task, by just the amount of rubble and rock that they had to clear just to get to the walls to fix them, guys. That they would give up. And they weren't. And so they were going to literally kill them for this work. So, I'll put it back up. Man. Verses 13 to 14. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. How powerful that statement is to these dads who are standing in the gap. Nehemiah does not have an army. What does he have? He has men who are fighting for their families because their families are important to them. Because it's worth protecting. It's valuable. Todd was talking about having a fire safe in your home. If you guys haven't seen the sermon from Sunday, I advise you to watch it. But he talks about having this fire safe in your home. And what do you put in the fire safe? Your most valuable papers and things that you cannot replace. Because even if your house burns down, they will be safe inside of the fire safe. That's the idea. What happens if you leave the door of the fire safe open and the house burns down? They're not protected, are they? What happens if your house burns down but you didn't have anything worth protecting in your safe? Then it doesn't matter, does it? They go together. I'm fascinated by this idea of Nehemiah coming to do this great work to build the walls around the city. And at one point, he's being tempted by the enemies to go into the temple to have a discussion, and he realizes, I can't step foot in there. I'm a layman. I'm not a priest. I'm just a regular guy. He thinks he's there to do a regular job, a regular guy's job. He's not qualified to go into the holy part of the city. And yet, without the wall, the temple is unprotected, right? But without the temple, there's nothing worth protecting, so there's no reason for the wall. I think that's interesting. You have something that you would consider divine and something that you would consider secular, and yet God ordains the building of this wall and protects them. Why would he do that? Does he need our protection? Does he need us to build a wall to keep him safe? I just think it's amazing. Why would he do that? Why would he allow them to build this wall around this temple? Because maybe there's something there that's worth protecting. And Nehemiah does this genius move of putting these men in front of their families. So for that enemy to come through to kill them, to get to the family, they're going to have to go through the men. And who are going to fight the most for their family? Some army that gets hired? No. It's amazing to me. And they're successful. God is fighting for us. And they're successful in rebuilding the wall. And in verse 16, and when all our enemies heard of it, this wall being rebuilt, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. The Bible tells us that this work was created or completed in 52 days. 52 days. And the enemy sees this progress, and they see the end result, and they cannot help but marvel at what has been accomplished. And it's not because of Nehemiah, and it's not because a bunch of guys are working really hard. They see the hand of God in this. Despite the challenges of working with a sword in one hand and a shovel in the other. It's amazing, guys. 52 days to repair the wall. It sounds miraculous. But I want you to think about the faithfulness of those who had come before Nehemiah all those years earlier. This was Hezekiah's wall first. 16 feet wide, Hezekiah's wall. When the king of Assyria was threatening to destroy Jerusalem. If you go back to your Bible, you'll see that Hezekiah sends him a tribute, essentially all the money in their treasury. And they had to take some of the gold from Solomon's temple to sweeten the deal and pay tribute to this king so that he wouldn't destroy the city. And the king of Assyria brings his army anyway. And the herald comes up to the city so that everybody can hear and says, you guys are fighting in the name of your God who's going to protect you. Think of all the other cities, and he lists all the other cities and all of the other gods who did not protect those cities from the king of the Assyrians. And then they launch their attack. And do you know that in the archaeological record today, in all of the cities from the south to the north of Israel, all of them have a burn layer from the Assyrian conquest except for one. One city. Is that a coincidence that Jerusalem was never conquered by the Assyrians when God said, no, I'm going to protect it for my sake? Amen. It's amazing. That's in our history. That's in our archaeological record. Nehemiah is rebuilding on top of this great, massive wall that was laid faithfully with the blood and sweat of the people that came before him. What kind of a foundation are we leaving for our children and our grandchildren? This is an opportunity for us to rise up when we see challenges, isn't it? And to build and to protect, because we have something worth protecting. And those who come after us, they're not starting over. Or they're not building on garbage. They're building on something strong. That's worth thinking about. Now, there were some other homes that news helicopter saw that had the same idea. They had the same idea. Not quite as high as the roof. Not nearly as wide as the other guy's wall. And as soon as there's a weakness, it's destroyed. This is a sobering image when I look at this image through the lens of spiritual eyes. Because we are surrounded by an enemy, even now, looking for a way in. And maybe you're not feeling the pressure because you're not doing anything to show that you're trying to build a wall up. I think that's interesting. Do you have something worth protecting? Is it time to do a sober assessment of what's around our families, what's around our homes, what's around your heart? What are you allowing in, and what's guiding you? Where is your priority? And let this be a reminder that the flood is coming. I think about Noah and how crazy that must have looked to be building that ark. What kind of sounds did Noah hear as that water was rising outside of his ark? What did he hear from the people that were trying to get in, do you think? The people that were there with their families grabbing onto them, looking for help and rescue, and they couldn't do anything about it. Because we can all go to the grocery store after the hurricane's here. I maybe could have said this a nicer way, maybe more polished, but this is what was on my heart. Not to scare you into doing anything that you don't know you're supposed to do already. But boy, we need some direction and guidance from something greater than ourselves. And these tools that you're going to be seeing over the next few base camps that are filling up this tool belt represent all of those things that are at our disposal that we can use to build up, to repair, to anticipate this flood that's coming. The flood waters are rising. Do you perceive it? And what are you doing to prepare against it? Thank you.